Correct. So good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Hunter Ohanian, and I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive. Let me turn my phone off right here. And we are very happy to welcome our guest this evening, Aaron Lechleiter. Lechleiter, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Hello, Aaron. Where are we finding you?
I'm in Provincetown right now.
Oh my goodness, what street in Provincetown? Not that
Pleasant.
they're going to...
Pleasant Street.
On Pleasant Street in Provincetown. Very good. So do you live in Provincetown full time?
Part-time.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. How are things at the A&P? Oh, I'm sorry, the Stop and the Grand Union or the Stop and
Still running either way.
Right. And okay, so if you're in Provincetown, I'm seeing a little bit of light coming out of that window behind you. It's probably a nice April day there.
It's a little, yeah, actually the sun is even peeking out.
Yeah.
It was rainy today.
Crocuses are beginning to come up. People are beginning to walk around. Life is beginning to stir in Provincetown.
It's about time. Yeah, we earned that.
That's great. That's great. Well, I want to welcome everybody. We're going to be talking about Aaron's book, Love's Next Meeting, and we're even going to be talking about the title of it. And so if you don't have a copy of it, please get one from your local independent bookstore. But let me tell everyone about Stonewall. We're located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've been around for 43 years, which is sort of astonishing. I've only been here for the last 60 years, it seems like. But anyway, it's we have one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the world. We have 30,000 volumes in the library of LGBTQ fiction, nonfiction, all organized under the Library of Congress system. And then in the archive, we have 2,500 linear feet. And if you think about that for a minute, that's all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. It is 6 million pages of LGBTQ history, mostly from, I would say 1950, maybe 1948, but it is very serial driven, as well as papers, of course, of different individuals. But the serials really, LGBTQ serials really started in the late 40s and into the 50s. But anyway, so it covers most of the United States as well as some international holdings as well. We're available for research. Please go to our website at stonewall-museum.org to make an appointment, and we help researchers out all the time in order to make that happen. Other things that are going on at Stonewall, we have this series of talks, and thanks to our friends at the Our Fund Foundation, who allowed us to make all of this stuff happen. And so thank you very much to you folks. We do talks probably twice a month now. We started this during COVID, but we do twice a month. And it's really an opportunity to talk to writers and historians, artists, curators, thinkers. We try to mix it up as much as we can. We're always looking for ideas. And so if you want us to talk to somebody, just again, go to stonewall-museum.org and we'll be happy to take your suggestion seriously. We do exhibitions, and primarily the exhibitions that we do focus around the holdings in the library and the archive. So right now we have one show up called Misinformation, the True and Not So True Facts about the Early Days of the AIDS Pandemic. And what that exhibition does, it compares the misinformation that went out from 1981 when people first saw that story in the New York Times about this mysterious disease that affected homosexuals in New York and San Francisco, and into the 80s when you had publications like the New York Native saying that gay men shouldn't take the test. And so comparing all the information out there at that time to what actually has recently happened in the last 2 years with COVID. And the similarities are just astonishing. And so please come by and see that. Additionally, we have a show of photographs up right now, beautiful silver gelatin prints by the artist Robert Giard. Robert passed away, I think in 2002. He started making photographs of LGBTQ writers and political activists in 85 or 86 and made them for about 15 years. He made over 400, over 500 images. And we're very fortunate to have 10 of those beautiful prints in the Hester Gallery right now. Additionally, I've been working like a bear recently. We are going to open a show at Nova Southeastern University here in Fort Lauderdale at the Alvin Sherman Library. It's 210 linear feet, and I packed it in. The show is called Queer History, and I packed in as much as I possibly could about how we can use serials to tell the story of LGBTQ history. So I actually start the show in 1937 with the first issue of The Bachelor, and the very last piece is the Miami Herald from last week, where it said that the governor of Florida signed the Don't Say Gay bill. And so it's a real journey up and down of all the things that have been happening to gay history. And so that will be up until middle or end of June. And then in addition, we do a national symposium for educators every year, and that will be coming up in 2 weeks. And it's really focused on LGBTQ curriculum. And so there are teachers from all around the country that learn how to use resources like Stonewalls and be able to put those facts into those curriculum, which is really important at a time in which we see cities and states and counties around the country banning books or trying to prohibit one's sexual orientation or gender identity being included in the classroom. So all those things are happening. It seems like much more. We're doing our first opera event. There's a wonderful book called Fellow Traveler, which was turned into an opera. I've not seen it, but we'll be doing we'll be doing a panel about that opera, and then we'll be taking a group of people. The Florida Grand Opera is bringing that in. So lots of stuff. Sign up at stonewall-museum.org to stay in touch with everything that we do. Now, the rules for tonight are really kind of simple. We just ask that if you have questions, just throw them into the chat or the Q&A. I want to say hello to our friends out there on Facebook. Thank you for watching us there as well. It brings a lot of people to these events. And if you have a friend who missed it, they can find it on our website. Give us about 24 hours and it gets posted there. I'd like to do a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Paula, are you back there somewhere? Hello, Paula, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Nice to see you. Thank you for your help. And so Paula's there to try to help us be sure that we all stay on time and that everything works technically here as well. So thank you, Paula, for your time. So Aaron, we're back to you now. I think I've gotten all the commercials out of the way, and so you're in Provincetown. How long have you been there?
Well, I guess I don't know. Since I've off and on since March 2020.
Were you spending time there before?
Yes, yeah, but not quite as religiously as since a small thing happened back in that March.
Yeah. So you're teaching these days. Where are you teaching?
Yeah, at UMass Boston. So I'm back and forth to teach my classes there every week.
One of the more engaging campuses I've ever seen.
It's great. Yeah, it's wonderful. In fact, Eileen Miles is one of our distinguished alumni, which
that's
many people don't know, but queer icon.
I did not know that. I did not know that about Eileen. What are you teaching at UMass?
Presently, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on gender and sexuality in U.S. history and culture. So pretty close to the work that I do myself. So
that's great. And interest level of your students these days overall?
High. You know, this is a graduate seminar, so that's typical. But I have to say, like, the younger students, the undergrads, are so engaged with queer studies. It's really profound, the difference in even just a couple decades of the level of engagement, the expectation that this kind of material is going to show up in their courses. Yeah, it's kind of an exciting time to be a professor right now, I think.
Does it, is it because they are just students of history, or do you think it affects them personally in some way, even if they're not queer, but it feels it resonates with them in their own experience?
I think it's the latter. I think that they're both thinking about sexuality and the relationship to of gender and sexuality in ways that are so much more capacious than some of the ways that I experienced those kinds of things as a undergraduate college student. And I think that they also just are sort of politicized. Students are just sort of looking at the world around them and they're thinking about what's going on, and climate change has sort of maybe created an existential uh, context for them that they just don't feel like they have the luxury to disengage. Maybe, you know, I'm Gen X, we made that our pastime, disengaging. And so I'm sort of optimistic about the future when I look at when I look at the undergraduates right now.
Yeah, and it's so great to hear you talk about the environment and the planet, in the sense that I do agree with you. My experience is certainly that that motivates them in so many ways, and sort of the bigger holistic picture that then affects other things, such as sexual orientation or relationships or all those other things. Because if your physical universe is not going to be safe, then how to any of these things matter? They all seem to fall underneath it.
It's a crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality in the Left in American Culture. Tell me a little bit about how this book came about.
So thanks, Hunter, for having me here, and thank you for the questions that you're going to be asking, and thank you for starting with that one. Certainly, this book came out of a longer interest that I had in sexuality studies, but also in working class studies. So, as somebody who had written and thought about U.S. working class history, I've always been sort of interested in any kind of social movements that incorporate or even centralize class politics, and that's oftentimes brought me into conversation with the left. But one of the things that I had sort of absorbed from a lot of the ways that I understood queer history was that there was this kind of pull, tension even, between homosexuals and homosexuality and the left up until the kind of halcyon moment of you know, the Gay Liberation Front and whatnot in the, you know, 60s into the 70s. So that I knew that there were some moments, you know, Terence Kissick has a great book about anarchism and homosexuality. So I knew that there were sort of moments in which there had been some kind of conversations happening between gay people and leftists. But I just wasn't sure how that connected with the period that, you know, that's sort of oftentimes presented as the golden age or whatever of the old left, in especially the Depression era. So the way that I came into this project was actually through literature. So when I started reading proletarian novels, or these kind of radical novels written to raise awareness about things like class conflict and racism and whatnot during the Depression era, during the 1930s.
Give us some examples. Give us some examples of those novels.
For example, H.T. Song wrote a novel called The Hanging on Union Square that was basically just about this guy trying to find a place to sleep and encountering all kinds of queer people on the streets of New York, and then becoming radicalized through those experiences and becoming, by the end of the novel, a sort of communist revolutionary. Another novel called Those Who Perish by a leftist writer named Edward Dahlberg came out a little bit later, but was the first, actually, no, it came out around the same time, but it was the first novel to actually talk about Hitler and the rise of fascism in Germany in 1934, actually, so really early days there. And in that novel, the kind of anti-fascist resistance that was depicted in the US in this very incipient moment of anti-fascism was sort of spearheaded by this experience of same-sex desire and homosexuality between two different characters. So this sort of ran counter to me, to the more common narrative that I understood, that suggested that the left was so antagonistic towards homosexuality that there was no way to imagine any kind of revolutionary sexual politics at that time. So that kind of set me looking at not only cultural representations, but also then individual biographies, leftist magazines and newspapers, everything from the Daily Worker to New Masses, to just find what were the conversations that were taking place, how were leftists thinking about homosexuality in sort of more complicated ways than what maybe conventional wisdom had led me to believe would be the case. And so that sort of set me on the path, and it took a long time to get here, but I was pretty excited by what I managed to find along the way.
And you spent a fair amount of time in archives in getting to that point. And certainly it seems as if you spent a lot of time reviewing serials and papers that gave you some sense of what's going on. It would seem to me, although I guess I'm about to disagree with what I'm about to say, but the serials might be the biggest trove of information, because there weren't a lot of papers. There are not a lot of papers left behind where people really are speaking about things. You talk at one point about how, I forget who it was, but it seems as if she had destroyed a fair amount and cut things out of her papers because she didn't want people to find them. But speak a little bit about what it was like trying to find some of the stuff, because we're talking about things, just so people know, we're talking about homosexuality and socialism and communism from the period of about 1920 to the mid-50s. And so in that period of time, we were finishing up World War I, we were moving into the Great Depression, we went into World War II, communists and socialists were our major enemy. China had moved into communism at that time. Certainly the Soviet Union had. We had to become partners through the Second World War, and then we had to deal with all of the McCarthyism and the anti-communist and gay movements that was going on there. So it was a very difficult time for these different political viewpoints.
I think that's right. And I would say that one of the things that is kind of compelling about that fact, the various points of repression that you're pointing to, whether it's anti-communism or whether it's homophobia or whatever the pressures are, in some ways that was kind of the point of entry for a lot of the folks I talk about in the book. In other words, if the state is repressing you as a gay person, and if there's a movement on the left to overthrow that state, that might be a compelling reason to join with the revolution, even if the revolution isn't naming you as the person who's going to benefit from it. So that kind of sense of rejecting all of the different dimensions of the repressive state, I think, was actually what animated a lot of the figures in the book that I talk about in the book to join up with the left. And what you're pointing out is also absolutely correct, that leaving behind traces of these lives was something that also created a sort of a challenge to me as a historian. But the folks who did preserve their records, it kind of speaks to a particular kind of intrepid bravery to actually do that. So Betty Millard, who you mentioned, was a lesbian communist who, in her diary, cut out passages that were a little too racy to want to keep around, because at any point, that could be used as evidence against her for any number of different crimes. So she cut out these passages, but I also think it's important to remember that she kept the rest of it, so cutting out those passages was very different than burning the whole diary, right? These figures who maintained various correspondence and diaries, there's not a ton of them, I think there would have been more if we didn't have these structures of oppression that made it, sort of contraband to hang on to this stuff. As you know, I'm sure Mattachine burned a lot of their records, and that was even later. So, there's kind of something incredibly powerful to me about anybody who kept letters, diaries, and correspondence. And when I found that, which I did, I was sort of amazed that any of that survived, just given the risk.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm with you 100% there. And do you feel that the serials that are intact are good records of what people were thinking and what their conversations were one-on-one at the time? I mean, I do. When I tend to focus more on stuff in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and there's still not a lot of records there. But I do find that I can get into people's heads by going through the serials and seeing what's going on. Do you feel that you got into people's heads by looking at the serials from the 20s and 30s and 40s?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that part of lived experience, especially within something that's a kind of radical organization or a social movement. I think you're talking about newspapers and magazines, right, Hunter?
Correct.
These kinds of publications, these newspapers, magazines, that people are reading in their mailbox, they're arriving in their mailbox and they're reading every month. They kind of give shape and structure to the kind of ways that they relate to people that they've never met, but that are part of the same kind of movement, or the same kind of, maybe identity later. So I think that it's an important way to access the past is through the cultural works that people leave behind. It helps us understand the language people are using, and it helps us understand the kinds of conversations that were at the foreground and in the background within different subcultural communities. I think it's always nice to be able to supplement that with those kind of interior lives that we can access through other kinds of documents. So, if the only thing that I had to work with were the kind of cultural texts in the form of magazines, newspapers, art, novels, and things, I think that what it would have sort of left out for me would be the kind of intimate lives of the participants themselves. So, I feel like the best kind of work is working with the different kinds of sources, that some of which is intimate and private, and some of which is kind of public and consumed broadly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And for me, of course, I always have a little degree of not skepticism, but I always understand that when I look at the serials or the publications, there is an individual or two who is directing that conversation.
That's right.
And so there are usually only a few hands at those controls. And so you're seeing a particular point of view, even though it may be voluminous as far as the number of words and letters and ideas that are placed out there, but not everybody has the bullhorn of being able to say that they are publishing the Mattachine Review or the latter. Right. They're great examples because you can assume that that's what gays and lesbians were thinking at the time, but that's an assumption on our part.
Yeah, and so I think that one of the things that's always useful is to think about the kinds of conversations that and expose disagreement within a publication. So when I see like a letter to the editor responding to something, that gives you a sense that, okay, remember, it's not only one sort of unified voice. And then sometimes in the case of New Masses, Betty Millard, who we were just talking about, that was a magazine that she ended up being on the masthead, but there were a lot of conversations happening that I found even in her correspondence around the fact that so many of the editors were men and were not thinking about women's issues, and when they were trying to bring more subscribers to leftist women's magazine, the magazine offered a set of like pots and pans, so like there certainly were ways that people were fighting behind the scenes to try and disrupt some of that control that you're pointing to here, but that was always something that was part of a conversation. It was never a sort of totalizing strategy.
All right, so let's go back to some of the beginning of the book and sort of let's sort of bring the whole idea of sexual dissidence and define what a sexual dissident is.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to try and be really careful to was while I was talking about homosexuality and the relationship between homosexuality and the left, a lot of the people who appear in the book would not have recognized themselves as homosexuals. So the way that they were enacting their sexual politics in ways that related to homosexuality might have been through a kind of alignment with a sort of lawlessness or a refusal to submit to the state discipline of what constituted lawful or respectable sexual behaviors and contact rather. So I use the word sexual dissidence a lot to refer to individuals who were taking a kind of an approach to thinking about sexuality that refused to submit to the kind of bourgeois respectability that was the same kind of force that pushed homosexuality to the margin. So sometimes that meant doing things like opposing marriage. Sometimes that meant things like taking a more broad, open approach towards thinking about sex work as being something that wasn't only repressive. Those kinds of conversations were inflecting and shaping the ways that radicals were thinking about homosexuality. So I sort of wanted to bring this conversation about sex more broadly as being not just the backdrop, but the kind of frame through which homosexuality was understood, whether individuals were themselves engaging in homosexual contact or not.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I imagine that you're not putting out there that the sexual dissidents were people who were intrinsically attracted to the opposite sex, who were having sex with members of the same sex simply for political action. You're not suggesting that.
I did not see instances of that. I think that maybe, I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's 10 years with Maria Key to know sort of what was happening there. But I didn't find any instances of like sort of what we might associate with kind of radical lesbian feminism in the 1970s that's positioning sexuality as itself a kind of radical act. So yeah, no, that wasn't what I was picking up on in this exact moment.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting because what I find, and you and I talked about this a little bit before in when we were chatting before we started about the idea that going back to Patrick Moore's book with the idea that the sexuality that was practiced by a lot of gay men, you know, through the Mine Shaft and the Saint and other places, that there was a certain amount of performative element to it, or performance art, or rejection of mores, which is what you're talking about here as well too. And so it's interesting how that sort of rises up. And I do wonder today, when we look in 2022 and we see people with who are gender nonconforming, or who find themselves on different parts of the gender spectrum, or the gender or non-binary, that if they too are sort of trying to mix their own sexual desire with a response to society around them.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there are ways that that sex and sexuality certainly connects with broader sort of ideological structures and relationships to structures of power and whatnot. And you know, one of the instances of that I found sort of fun in this book was when a queer couple, Ruth Erickson and Eleanor Stevenson, in the 1940s were getting really involved in leftist activities sort of as a couple and writing letters back and forth to politicians, sort of complaining about anti-communism and Red Scare stuff. In their private life, they were sort of playfully adapting Popular Front, sort of anti-fascist leftist rhetoric to describe their own relationship to gender. So the statement, the people yes, which sort of became the kind of motto of the anti-fascist left in the period of the mid 1930s into the 1940s. For them, the people yes was also a way to talk about different kind of performances of gender in their personal relationships. And so that kind of repurposing and sort of overlap of political messages and individual gender presentation, that kind of playfulness, I think that the playfulness around that is something that was a big part of what a lot of these folks in the book were doing and thinking about, but it's oftentimes imagined to have not really been possible because there was so much state repression. And, you know, not to discount that, but it was more complicated.
Yes. So when we think about the book and the periods that you've looked at in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and we think about sort of the establishment, if you will, of socialism and the Communist Party, any sense about movement as to how the organization accepted or shunned gay people?
Yeah, and so I would say, you know, there's different kinds of organizations and factions that act out in certain ways, but one of the things that's sort of undeniable is that, especially when you move into the Cold War era, and especially when you move into, you know, the kind of McCarthyism of the 1950s, that just fundamentally shifted everybody's relationship to the left, and it shifted everybody's relationship to homosexuality as well. So within the Communist Party, there was just so much fear because of the fact that there were people being hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee. There was so much state discipline that there was a kind of paranoia, I think, that sort of closed ranks around anything that was seen as non-respectable. So an organization that had really attracted people by pulling in anybody who did not like the bourgeoisie, you know, people who were emphatically kind of like on the side of rejecting respectability politics, under the intense pressures of the American Red Scare during the Cold War era. You know, the same organization sort of was doing the same thing that the state was doing, and disciplining and expelling and otherwise, you know, making the organization really inhospitable to queer people. It's a tragedy, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's my sense as well from my reading is that it's you know, it was okay to mix with homosexuals as long as like everything wasn't on the line, but then once things got really scary, then people had to pull back because it became problematic for it. And I do wonder whether or not that's true with regard to acceptance of people of color, and also with regard to respect and acceptance of women as well too.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really try to think about in this book and more broadly as a scholar is how those kinds of intersections shape the social movements that are responding to you know, various forms of state repression. So certainly I think that the anti-racism of the left in the Depression era was something that was a tremendous draw to all kinds of people, not only bringing more people of color and African Americans into the left, but also sort of suggesting that there might be ways that the rejection of American racism that was found on the left could also lead to a rejection of other kinds of social ills as well, be that and prejudice against homosexuals, as the Black journalist John Pittman phrased it in his newspaper, various forms of sexism. There was a kind of reflexivity, I think, around trying to imagine that one social movement could bleed into another social movement. And I think that, you know, that was one of the reasons why the left was a target, you know, in the US government, was because the left was speaking out against multiple forms of repression. Yeah, and so that kind of shapes and frames some of how we understand the McCarthy era too, such as it is.
Our friend Michaela writes, why do you think the leftist organizations of the late 60s and 70s, the SDS, anti-war movement, feminists, did not want to be associated with lesbians and gays?
It's a great question, and I should say for myself that my book ends at 1960, so it's not something that I really dug into with this project. So I do think that the left changed so much as a result of two big pressures prior to the 60s and 70s. The first being the rise of fascism, because the kind of revolutionary movement of the 1930s, before the existential threat of Hitler's rise to power in Europe, this kind of revolutionary movement became a much more broadly based coalitionist movement that was, you know, in some respects less driven by a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism altogether and more towards imagining a kind of vision of democracy. And then after that transformation sort of allowed for a space for individual constituencies to advocate for themselves, then McCarthyism and the Cold War comes in and makes even this kind of like low grade push for radical democracy. Like, we're not even really talking about revolutionary overthrow of the state at this point. We're talking about a kind of radical democracy. Even that becomes suspect, and even that becomes, you know, policed. The 60s new left came in, and they were sort of frustrated looking back at the timidity of these leftist organizations that had been, you know, kind of scarred by their experiences leading up to that moment. And I think it took a while to really figure out how to build something new. And, you know, I think that there were folks involved in any of those movements, like, you know, Paul Goodman maybe is somebody who sort of threads that needle a little bit. You know, certainly there were queer feminists that were coming out of the left. In fact, Betty Millard became a sort of important lesbian feminist later in her life. But I think that the impact of the past definitely shaped the sort of after story that extends beyond the scope of what I was looking too deeply at.
Yeah, and of course, and I admitted this to you earlier, sometimes when I think about you know, the left in American culture, I just immediately go to the 1960s and 70s vis-a-vis homosexuality, and of course there was a lot going on. You touched on this point in your answer, and I wanted to ask you to expound on this a little bit more about the queer anti-fascism movement, and so talk a little bit about what that was about.
Yeah, so again, one of the things that just can't be overstated is the impact of something like an existential threat of fascism on broad-based social movement organizing. I think that when you go from a moment of sort of envisioning a utopian society to having to throw all of your energy into responding to a very clear and present existential threat, that both takes a lot of energy away from other kinds of fights, and it also takes a lot of the resources that might be expended on more broad-based coalitionist movements to really trying to push back this very immediate threat of fascism. And, you know, for leftists in the US, certainly, you know, the Spanish Civil War was a sort of benchmark in the anti-fascist struggle, the aligning with the anti-fascism that was, of course, resisting Hitler's rise to power, as I was talking about earlier. All of that was important work, but it was work that required a kind of all hands on deck approach that looked really different than the kind of revolutionary anti-capitalism that had been sort of the form that the left took prior to that. So a lot of the language that you see on the left in that moment is sort of is trying to imagine a seat for everybody at the table. And that becomes sort of the singular focus. And on the one hand, I think that that's a good thing, right? Because that's sort of like how you get from, I think, the old left of the 1930s to something like the homophile movement in the 1950s, is precisely by allowing for individuals to say that, you know, fascism is anti-democratic, you know, fighting fascism requires allowing everybody a seat at the table. And that, you know, and that sort of produces some of the social movements that come forward in the 1950s. I think that the sort of what gets lost in that is the kind of sense that that everybody should be fighting for everybody else as well. And so there's a sort of maybe fracturing of the different constituencies. So at the same time, you have a kind of emergent gay rights movement in the 1950s that becomes kind of detached from anti-racism. It becomes detached from kind of working class politics and union organizing and things like that, that there's a way that there's this new approach to radical organizing that allows space for setting different movements up against one another rather than trying to fight this sort of like big structure. It becomes fighting for your own place a little bit, for better or for worse.
And of course, those movements have continued on, you know, I mean, more recently, when we think about Black Lives Matter, there have been a number of other elements which have worked their way into there too. Or remember, it seems like a million years ago now, but remember the Occupy Wall Street movement and the sense of the different factions that were trying to work things out through that as well. And certainly even during, you know, during the AIDS and the ACT UP movement as well too, there were there were other people at the table that were fighting for things. Let's go back again though to sort of the homophile movement and the Mattachine Society, and you certainly speak about Harry Hay in the book, and but what do you think caused that? What caused that movement? Was it social change? Was it the anti-gay left? Was it McCarthyism? What do you think caused that movement? Because to me, it seems that was the bedrock upon which so many other things happened afterwards. But was it because of what Eisenhower did with his executive order? Was it because of the military's role toward gays and in the military? What caused that movement?
I mean, you know, for me, and maybe this is because of the perspective that I have, seeing this as part of a longer history of leftist organizing, I really see the homophile movement as a product of the Popular Front. So, you know, the Popular Front is a term used to kind of characterize this moment in the 1930s with the rise of fascism, in which the most kind of radical leftist cadre aligned themselves with kind of New Deal liberal Democrats rather than seeing them as being social fascists who were kind of reactionary. Instead, there was this sense we have to work together. And there was this kind of coalition that built in the Popular Front era that allowed for a broader movement that incorporated people who maybe didn't have the same kind of degree of militant anti-capitalist ideology driving them. I really see the homophile movement of the 1950s as an outgrowth of that. And part of that is because the Popular Front really did shift that rhetoric from being revolutionary overthrow of the state to demanding some kind of what later we would think of as participatory democracy. And that, I think, allowed for the various former members of the Communist Party who were very familiar with the vicissitudes and the sort of shifts on the left to say, wait a second, like this is kind of a point in which we can enter into this conversation as gay people. Like there's a vocabulary to draw from here. So I do see the homophile movement as a kind of outgrowth of the Popular Front left. But you know, I think that kind of shifts. Like once in 1953, the fear of being too close to the left becomes much more dominant in the leadership, and those original members are kind of pushed out of the movement that they had built. You know, I think that it becomes something a little bit different. But the early organizing impulse, I do think, grows out of that Popular Front leftist energy.
That's really interesting, and I would agree with that. Just to stick with the 1950s here for a second, how much do you believe that the McCarthy hearings and the Red Scare was the Lavender Scare?
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Well,
I think they were connected.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be vague about it. There are some that believe that part of what that movement was about was rooting communists out of government, and then others who believe it wasn't just communists, but there was a real intentionality to remove homosexuals out of government. And I've read a lot about that discussion, and I'm always curious to know how people feel that what was the real motivation, or particularly people who've done the research that you have. What do they believe the real motivation was behind that aggressive move in this country in the 1950s?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the Cold War era sort of both, it created a pretense to be able to enact any number of different forms of repression. So it's not like the idea that gay people were not good citizens emerged in the 1950s. There was all kinds of rhetoric pointing in that direction building up to it. But the Cold War era sort of presented a perfect opportunity to set policy around that idea. And I think that was true of the left as well. So I don't think that gay people were just kind of caught up in this dragnet and were kind of unintended victims of this broader thing. I think that the Cold War was kind of taken up as a perfect storm to be able to enact all kinds of different forms of repression and oppression of multiple groups. I do think that the sort of anti-communism, the kind of ideology of anti-communism was front and center in that, but some of that was also an attempt to disrupt the civil rights movement, so I think that these pieces all kind of they're sort of wheels within wheels, and one doesn't necessarily obviate the other.
Yeah, but I think that's a wonderful observation about it, in the sense that it was really anybody who was not a white male heteronormative was sort of swept up into that period. Well, we have a little time left, and I know that you have prepared some slides. Of course, I'm a big fan of visuals, and so so can we ask you to share your screen, and maybe we can scroll through some of these. Some of these topics I know we've already discussed, but I think in the context of the visuals, it might be helpful.
Yeah, so I won't go through all of these in too much detail, but just to give a kind of sense of the texts that sort of were really important for framing the book. One of the places where I really wanted to start was with this editorial from The Spokesman, which was a Black radical newspaper that in 1932 ran this editorial, Prejudice Against Homosexuals. This was sort of interesting to me because in some ways, this doesn't quite make sense with the typical chronology that we think about as being the history of sort of politicizing homosexuality. The idea that a Black radical newspaper that had no connection to gay politics would run an editorial that was connecting race politics and gay politics together in the 1930s, like that sort of seemed like a puzzle. And so I wanted to sort of find what sort of might have given rise to that. And that was one of the sort of points of entry here. And I talk about that pretty extensively in the book, but that was 1932. Where am I here? So one of the things that I also tried to attend to in the book was thinking, okay, so we have these kinds of representations of kind of a progressive politics of homosexuality, but they exist in some kind of tension with the way that the left is also sort of doubling down on some of the structures of homophobia that governed representations outside the left. So cartoons like this one, which was from the leftist magazine, The Liberator in 1922, that features two kind of sulking pansies complaining about a strike, suggested that homosexuality might be perceived and constructed as represented as some kind of bourgeois decadence, that there was something reactionary about homosexuality because it emphasized kind of consumption rather than production. And, any good radical wanted to be on the side of labor, not on the side of the consumer. So, those kinds of images did circulate on the left. So I want to just be kind of clear here that this is not a single story in which the left is entirely on the side of liberation. It goes sort of back and forth. It changes at different moments. Let's see. How do I advance my, okay. I want to get to some of the labor images because I know you and I were talking about those before we began here, Hunter. But one of the unions that I talk about here from the 1940s was a labor union called the Marine Cooks and Stewards. This was a radical labor union. It was emphatically an interracial labor union that was pushing against some of the racial restrictions that were oftentimes plaguing the labor movement during this time period. It was based in San Francisco, and it organized workers on cruise liners, specifically workers who were doing the kind of domestic labor on boats. So those were the people that were cooking food and the workers that were serving food. And one of the things that was interesting about this union was that it was a lot more open to having gay members, sort of openly gay members, than most of the other unions at the time. And it was also one of the most radical unions that had largely communist affiliated leadership at the top channels of power within the union. I was interested in not only this union's politics, but also the ways that extended into the way that they represented labor. So we tend to think, I think, of labor iconography of the Depression era and the 30s and 40s as oftentimes having like this kind of male musculature that's like super beefy, physical, manual representations of manual labor. And the Marine Cooks and Stewards just refused to produce that kind of imagery, and instead had all of these images of kind of interracial solidarity, quiet moments of intimacy in the workplace, a sort of gentleness to them that I think spoke to both the radical rejection of normativity within the union, and then also something that allowed for a kind of queer sort of representation that pushed against some of the dominant structures of visuality of the labor movement at the time.
And just tell our audience, go back there, just remind people who Pele Delapp is.
Pele Delapp was basically a cartoonist who did a lot of the images that were just kind of peppered throughout the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union newsletter, which was called the MCS Voice. These were never signed, but she wrote a nice little memoir many years later and talked about her experiences working with the MCS and later People's World and various other. She did a lot of labor and leftist art over the course of her lifetime, and was just a generally interesting artist. Yeah. This is just another example of that from within the Marine Cooks and Stewards. It's just so explicitly operating in a different register than a lot of the sort of musculature and masculinity of a lot of the labor iconography at the time.
Of course, I mean, you can see the gay gaze in there so easily that
you really can, and it's just such a camp. It's so campy, you know. A lot of the political cartoons that I was looking at in my research, there was a sort of camp, whether that was in somebody like, you know, Mark Blitzstein's musical Cradle Will Rock, or in images like this one that I have up on the screen now. There was a sort of playfulness that was again, sort of in contrast to some of the sense that the only kinds of images that could circulate during this time period was a kind of upraised fist and a march with like signs and placards. There was a lot more happening on the left than just this sort of familiar story that I think is part of what we know. I feel like I should let the questions.
Sure. Let's. Why don't you stop sharing? So we have a quick question here about haven't read your book. Do you discuss or mention Emma Goldman?
Yes, and I will say that again. There's a great book by Terence Kissick called. Oh my God, I'm not going to be able to think. Free Comrades. It's called Free Comrades. And he really talks about anarchists in the early 20th century. So I yield to him a little bit on that. My book starts a little bit later than that. But he has a really smart and engaging analysis of Emma Goldman in relation to homosexuality. She does appear in my book in a couple of places, but I would say if you're interested in thinking about especially late 19th, early 20th century anarchists, Terence Kissick's work is fantastic and definitely worth a read.
And we have a question here from Charles. I believe that there was a neo-Nazi group in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 80s composed of gay men. I think it was called the Nationalist Socialist League. And it is said that Harry Hay and others from Mattachine had a communist party type structure. And so a question for you is what is your theory of this reverse of LGBTQ folks incorporating left social structures in their organizations?
I'm not sure I completely understand. I'm not completely following the question, but I will say that the early formation of Mattachine was absolutely borrowing like the kind of cell structure of the Communist Party prior to 1924. So that is to say that the early days of Mattachine, people didn't know the whole organization. They knew the people that were in their particular cell, and it was kind of governed by a kind of secrecy that was abandoned fairly quickly. That was abandoned fairly quickly for a more open structure. But certainly the folks who founded Mattachine were coming out of the communist left, and so they were familiar with the kinds of structures of secrecy that oftentimes governed radical organizing, probably through their own experiences. The Gay Nationalist League, I just was reading something about this somewhere, and I'm trying to remember where. But yeah, I mean, there certainly were connections between homosexuality and fascism as well. The people have talked about that with respect to leadership in Nazi Germany, like within the Nazi organizing, government. And so, those kinds of connections were possible as well, and that happened within the U.S. later too. It's sort of disturbing and distressing. But yeah, that was definitely, there wasn't only homosexuality in the left, that's for sure.
For sure. Well, we've run out of time. We're down to the last minute. And I have one last question for you, which is the subtitle of your book is The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left. And it raised a question in my mind. How much did Americans know about what was happening at the time? Or was this really something that was consolidated between those on the far left and homosexuals? It's the forgotten part that I'm sort of asking about here.
Well, I think that there definitely was some of this was happening in ways that maybe weren't on the radar of your, reader of Good Housekeeping magazine or something like that, that was like strictly within the mainstream currents of American society. But I do think that some of what gets forgotten by the mid 20th century is forgotten because it's inconvenient. So, there are people on the right who in the 1950s are saying there is a long-standing relationship between they wouldn't say queer people, but between gay people and the Communist Party. And it's actually from within organizations like Mattachine by the mid 1950s and One that are saying, no, that never happened. Like, we are the most anti-communist group that you can imagine. And so that effort to kind of disavow, I think, is part of why some of this story gets forgotten. And I don't want to sort of like cast blame here, because I think that the pressures of that moment were intense. I think that there really was a real threat to individuals who were not towing the party line during the McCarthy era. It was a really difficult, challenging time for people, whether they were gay or leftist or involved in the civil rights movement. The threats were real, the danger was real. But I also think that had an impact on how the past got narrated that made it hard to remember more complicated histories of that relationship.
And all we have to do is just see what's going on in the world today in the Ukraine, or what was happening in this country, 2 years ago, and we can see how those things can be bubbling up, and how close we came to these different kind of things. Well, Aaron Lechleiter, thank you so much for being here. It's been a great conversation. Obviously, it's like it never. We never have enough time to get into all of these things, and it's just so. The book, of course, is Love's Next Meeting, and I didn't even get to ask you what that means. I can't even ask you that now, because you'll have to read the book, because the answer is in the book. And so please try to get this from your local bookseller. I want to say goodnight to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's back there. Paula, thank you. It's great to see you, and thank you for all of you being here. Again, go to stonewall-museum.org and sign up to get our weekly newsletter. And I don't know who's coming up next, but it will be back in another 2 weeks. And if you have anybody who wants to see the show, find it on our website at stonewall-museum.org in about 24 hours. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you all soon. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.